He offered a roof to a man on the run, a simple act of mercy in a lonely life. He had no idea that the roof he offered, and the man beneath it, would shield him from a storm he never saw coming. The silence of Arthur Rossi's farm was a living thing. It was made of the whisper of wind through dry corn stalks, the groan of aging timber in the barn, and the vast, empty space left behind by his wife, Eleanor, 5 years ago. At 72, Arthur's world had shrunk to the edges of his property line, a little island of weathered wood and struggling soil adrift in the changing landscape of the American heartland. His days were a metronome of routine: wake before dawn, check on the 2 milk cows that were more pets than profit, tend a garden that grew just enough for one, and spend the evenings staring at a television that offered only noise, not company. His son Michael was a ghost in this silence, a framed photograph on the mantle of a young man in an army uniform, lost to a war in a country Arthur couldn't find on a map. Loneliness wasn't just an emotion, it was the architecture of his life. One Tuesday night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, flashing silent heat lightning, the silence was broken. A frantic knocking echoed from his front door, sharp and desperate against the rhythmic hum of the cicadas. Arthur's heart, a slow and steady drum, skipped a beat. No one came to his door after dark, ever. He picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a familiar but small comfort, and shuffled to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw a man hunched against the railing, his face obscured by the shadows of the porch roof. He was soaked, not from the rain that was yet to fall, but from what looked like sweat or something else. The man's clothes were dark and torn, and one hand was pressed tightly against his side. Arthur was not a brave man, not anymore. The world had taught him that bravery often led to heartbreak. His first instinct was to do nothing, to wait for the man to give up and leave. But then the man stumbled, catching himself on the railing, and a low groan of pain cut through the night. It was a sound Arthur knew too well. It was the sound of a body giving up. He thought of Michael, of the telegram, of a world that offered no mercy. He opened the door a crack, the safety chain still engaged. "What do you want?" His voice was rough from disuse. The man looked up, and in the sliver of light from the hallway, Arthur saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a madman or a thief. They were eyes filled with exhaustion and a desperate, hunted plea. "Please," the man rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "I don't need anything. Just a place to rest, out of sight." "Your barn? I won't be any trouble." What would you have done? Would you have turned him away, back into the swallowing darkness? Before we continue the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Arthur stood there for a long moment, the cool metal of the poker in one hand, the fate of a stranger in the other. Every rational thought screamed at him to slam the door, to call the sheriff, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude. The man was trouble, plain and simple. Trouble came in many forms, and this one was bleeding through his shirt. Yet there was that sound again, that soft, guttural groan of pain that reminded him of the final days with Elena, when every breath was a battle. He remembered her whispering, "Kindness, Artie. It's the only thing that costs nothing and is worth everything." He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. The world had taken everything from him. What more could this stranger possibly do? He slid the chain off. He didn't invite the man into his house. That was a line he wouldn't cross. "The barn," Arthur said, his voice firm. "There's a clean stall in the back with old hay, but that's it. In the morning, you're gone." The man nodded, a wave of relief washing over his pale features. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with genuine gratitude. "God bless you." Arthur just grunted, leading the way with a heavy-duty flashlight that cut a sharp beam through the thickening dark. The air was heavy, charged with the coming storm. As they walked the short distance, the man's limp was more pronounced, his breathing more ragged. He leaned against the barn door as Arthur wrestled with the old, swollen wood. Inside, The barn smelled of earth, hay, and time. It was Arthur's sanctuary, a place filled with the ghosts of better days, of a bustling farm, of his father's laughter, of Michael, as a boy, learning to milk their first cow. He pointed the flashlight to a stall at the far end. "There, keep the door closed." He turned to leave, his duty done. But as the flashlight beam swept across the man, it caught the dark, spreading stain on his side. It was much worse than Arthur had thought. He stopped, his back to the stranger. He could just walk away. It wasn't his problem. The man had asked for a roof, and he'd given it, but Elena's voice echoed in his mind again. He let out another long, slow breath. "Wait here." He returned a few minutes later with a bucket of water, some clean rags, a bottle of antiseptic, and a roll of bandages from the old first aid kit he kept for the animals. He set them down on a hay bale just outside the stall. "It's the best I can do," he mumbled, not looking the man in the eye. "Thank you," the stranger said again, his voice softer this time, filled with a quiet disbelief. "My name is Leo." Arthur didn't offer his in return. He just nodded and retreated to his house, locking the door behind him. He sat in his worn armchair, the poker back in its place, and listened to the first drops of rain begin to fall. He had let a wolf into his sheepfold, and he could only wonder what the morning would bring. Sleep did not come easily to Arthur. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every gust of wind from the rising storm, sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He found himself staring out the kitchen window toward the barn, a dark silhouette against a sky now streaked with lightning. He was an old man. He had no business getting involved in whatever this was. He had broken the cardinal rule of his solitary existence. He had let the outside world in. The man, Leo, had a face that was hard to read. It was etched with pain, but also with a kind of weary resolve Arthur hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't the face of a common vagrant. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a watchfulness that was unnerving. Who was he running from? And what would they do if they found him here? Morning came, grey and washed clean by the storm. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and cool. Arthur went through his morning rituals on autopilot, his mind fixed on the barn. The deal was that the man would be gone by morning. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hand trembling slightly, and walked to the back door. He stood on the porch, sipping the hot liquid, his eyes scanning the property. There was no sign of movement. He told himself it was for the best. Leo was gone, a ghost of the night, and Arthur's life could return to its quiet, predictable rhythm. He finished his coffee and walked toward the barn, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He had to check. He had to be sure. He slid the heavy door open, a sliver of morning light piercing the dusty darkness within. He called out, "Leo!" No answer. He stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the scattered hay. He walked to the back stall. The bucket and rags were there, but they had been used. The water was stained a murky red, and a few blood-soaked cloths lay beside it. The bandages were gone, but the man was not. He was lying in the hay, pale and still, his breathing shallow. His eyes fluttered open as Arthur approached. "I tried to leave," he rasped, his voice weak. Couldn't make it far. He had a fever. Arthur could feel the heat radiating off him even from a few feet away. The wound, crudely bandaged, must have been infected. Arthur looked down at the man, this stranger who was now a prisoner of his own injury on Arthur's land. The choice was no longer simple. Kicking him out now wasn't just turning him away, it was a death sentence. And Arthur, for all his curated solitude, knew he wasn't a killer. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and felt the man's forehead. It was burning. What had he gotten himself into? This was more than just trouble. This was a life hanging in the balance, a life that was now inexplicably tied to his own. For the next 3 days, Arthur's farm became a makeshift infirmary. His quiet routine was shattered, replaced by a tense cycle of caregiving and vigilance. He brought Leo weak broth, water, and the old antibiotics he kept for his cows, hoping they were close enough to what a human needed. He cleaned and redressed the wound, a nasty gash that looked like it had been made by something sharp and unforgiving. During these moments, an unspoken intimacy formed between them. Arthur worked with the silent, practiced hands of a farmer who had mended countless injuries on his animals, and Leo submitted with a quiet trust that was both humbling and unnerving. He rarely spoke, conserving his energy, but his eyes followed Arthur's every move, a flicker of gratitude in their depths. Arthur learned things about the man not through words, but through observation. Leo's hands, though calloused, were well kept. He had a tattoo of a small, intricate cross on his wrist, partially hidden by his watch, and despite the fever and pain, he carried himself with a certain discipline, a coiled stillness that suggested a life of control, now surrendered to circumstance. Arthur found himself talking, filling the silence of the barn with stories of his life, of Elena, of the farm in its heyday. He spoke of Michael, of his pride, and his unending grief. He wasn't sure if Leo was even lucid enough to understand, but the words poured out of him, a release of pressure that had been building for 5 years. He was speaking to the stranger, but he was also speaking to himself, giving voice to the ghosts that haunted his quiet home. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Arthur arrived in the barn with a bowl of soup to find Leo sitting up, his back against the stall wall, his eyes clear for the first time. "The tractor," Leo said, his voice stronger, raspier. "Out back. The engine won't turn over, will it?" Arthur stopped, surprised. "No, been dead for a year. Can't afford to get it fixed." He relied on old-fashioned manpower for most things now, his world shrinking even further without the machine. "I can fix it," Leo said. "I'm good with engines." Arthur was skeptical. "You can barely stand." "Give me a few days," Leo insisted. "Let me pay you back for this." "For everything." Arthur looked at the man, a stranger who now knew his deepest sorrows and saw a flicker of the person he must have been before he'd shown up bleeding at his door, capable, confident, and determined. Allowing him to stay longer went against every instinct. But the thought of hearing the old John Deere rumble to life again, a sound he associated with prosperity and hope, was a powerful lure. It was a risk, a huge one. But as he looked at his fallow fields, he realized he was tired of just letting things die. He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll see." The decision felt momentous, a shift in the silent contract between them. He wasn't just harboring a fugitive anymore. He was entering into a partnership, and he had no idea where it would lead. The next week marked a quiet transformation on the Rossi farm. As Leo regained his strength, a new rhythm took hold. True to his word, he spent his days in the shade of the large oak tree behind the barn, methodically taking apart the tractor's engine. Arthur watched from a distance at first, a mix of suspicion and curiosity. But it soon became clear that Leo knew exactly what he was doing. His movements were precise, economical, and patient. He treated the rusty, neglected machinery with a surgeon's care. Arthur found himself drawn in, fetching tools, cleaning parts, and listening as Leo explained the mechanics in a low, calm voice. They worked in a comfortable silence, the clinking of metal and Leo's quiet instructions replacing the oppressive stillness that had defined Arthur's life. In these shared hours, the barrier between them began to dissolve. Arthur saw that Leo's promise wasn't just about repayment, it was about a need for purpose, a desire to create rather than destroy. He saw the satisfaction on Leo's face when he finally identified the problem, a cracked cylinder head. "We can't get a new one of these," Arthur said, his hopes sinking. "Not for this model, not anymore." Leo just wiped the grease from his hands with a rag. "We don't need a new one. We can fix it. I just need a welding torch and some scrap metal." It was a bold claim, but Arthur found himself believing it. He had the tools in his workshop, gathering dust for years. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the air was filled with the smell of ozone from the welder and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. They shared a simple meal of bread and stew Arthur had cooked. For the first time, Arthur asked a personal question. "Where did you learn to do all that?" Leo was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "My father. He owned a garage back in the old neighborhood. Taught me everything. Said a man who can fix things will always have value." There was a hint of a world far removed from this rural quiet, a world of city blocks and close-knit communities. "He was a good man," Leo added softly, a note of finality in his tone that discouraged further questions. Arthur respected the boundary. He understood that some pasts were better left undisturbed. He had his own ghosts. It was only fair to let Leo have his. But as he looked at the man beside him, a man who had brought the sound of life back to his dying farm, he felt a growing sense of connection, a fragile trust taking root in the shared soil of their unspoken sorrows. And yet, a nagging question remained. If his father was a simple mechanic, who was Leo running from? 2 days later, the impossible happened. A deep, rumbling cough echoed across the farm, followed by the steady, powerful roar of the John Deere's engine firing to life. Arthur was feeding the chickens when he heard it, and he dropped the bucket of feed, spinning around. Leo was in the driver's seat, a wide, triumphant grin on his face, a sight that transformed his usually guarded features. Grease stained his hands and face, but his eyes shone with pride. The sound was more than just a running engine, it was a resurrection. It was the sound of hope, of possibility, of a future that wasn't solely defined by decay. Arthur felt a laugh bubble up from his chest, a genuine, hearty sound he hadn't made in years. He walked over to the tractor, placing a hand on the vibrating fender, feeling its power like a heartbeat. "You did it," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually did it." Leo cut the engine, and in the ensuing silence, something shifted between them permanently. The debt was paid, but the bond remained. "It was the least I could do, Artie," Leo said, using the nickname for the first time. Arthur didn't correct him. That afternoon, for the first time in over a year, Arthur tilled the fallow field beside the house. With Leo offering advice from the side, he felt the old, familiar rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of turning the earth, preparing it for new life. It felt like he was preparing his own life for something new as well. He decided then and there he couldn't send Leo away, not yet. The man had become a part of the farm's fragile ecosystem, and Arthur was starting to realize how much he needed the company. That evening, he made the offer. "You can stay," he said, trying to sound casual. "The cot in the workshop is better than the hay. You can help around the place. I can't pay you much, but—" He trailed off, unsure how to phrase it. Leo looked at him, his expression serious. "Artie, you don't know who I am. It might not be safe for you." "I know you're a good mechanic," Arthur replied, meeting his gaze. "I know you kept your word. That's enough for me for now." It was a willful ignorance, a conscious choice to accept the man in front of him and ignore the shadows that clung to his past. A part of him knew this peace was temporary, a bubble that could burst at any moment. As Leo moved his few belongings into the small, dusty workshop, a sense of normalcy settled over them. But as Arthur watched a news report that night about a violent power struggle within a prominent Chicago crime family, he saw a fleeting, grainy photograph of a man wanted for questioning. The photo was blurry, but the eyes were hauntingly familiar. He quickly turned the television off, his heart pounding. The quiet was about to be broken in a way neither of them could ever have predicted. The fragile peace on the farm lasted for 2 blissful weeks. It was an Indian summer of sorts for Arthur's soul. He and Leo fell into a routine that felt as old as the seasons. They repaired fences, cleared brush, and even planted a small, late-season vegetable garden. Leo's presence was a quiet, steadying force. He worked hard, ate whatever Arthur put in front of him, and never complained. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was respectful, resourceful, and possessed a deep, innate sense of order. He fixed the leaky barn roof, sharpened all of Arthur's dull tools, and even managed to get the old water pump working at full pressure again. The farm, under their combined efforts, began to shed its air of neglect, breathing with a renewed sense of purpose. For Arthur, it was like waking from a long slumber. He felt his own strength returning, the ache in his joints lessening with the daily activity. He was no longer just an old man waiting for the end. He was a farmer again, but a storm was gathering on a different horizon. One morning, a sleek black car pulled up the long gravel driveway. Arthur's heart seized in his chest. It wasn't a police car, but it radiated an official, unwelcome authority. A man in a crisp suit, Mr. Henderson from the county bank, stepped out. His smile was thin and predatory. "Arthur," he said, his tone slick with false friendliness. "Just make him around." Arthur knew exactly what this was about. He was behind on his mortgage payments. He'd been scraping by for years, but a bad crop 2 seasons ago had put him deep in the red. He had been ignoring the letters, hoping for a miracle. "I know I'm late, Mr. Henderson," Arthur said, his voice tight. "I'm working on it." Henderson's eyes swept over the property, a flicker of cold calculation in his gaze. "The bank has been very patient, Arthur. But patience has its limits. We have an investor who is very interested in this parcel. They've made a generous offer, enough to cover your debt and leave you with a little something." He was talking about foreclosure, but dressing it up in the language of opportunity. "This is my home," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a quiet rage. "My family has worked this land for 3 generations. And that's a lovely story," Henderson said with a dismissive wave. "But it doesn't pay the bills. You have 30 days, Arthur. Get the account current or we move forward with the acquisition." "It's just business." He got back in his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and despair in his wake. Arthur stood there, his fists clenched, the weight of his father and grandfather's legacy pressing down on him. The farm wasn't just land, it was his history, his identity, and he was about to lose it all. Leo had been watching from the barn, his face a mask of stone. He walked over to Arthur, his expression grim. "What was that about?" When Arthur explained, the look in Leo's eyes hardened into something Arthur had never seen before, a cold, dangerous resolve. The wolf he had taken in was no longer dormant. The banker's visit shattered the idyllic bubble they had built. A heavy, anxious silence fell over the farm once more, but this time it wasn't born of loneliness, but of shared dread. Arthur was devastated. The 30-day deadline felt like a guillotine hanging over his head. He shuffled through his days in a daze, the joy of the farm's revival completely overshadowed by the looming threat of its loss. He barely ate. He couldn't sleep. The land that had been his sanctuary now felt like a prison, its borders defining the scope of his failure. He saw Henderson's smug face everywhere, a symbol of a cold, indifferent world that chewed up and spat out men like him. He felt powerless, old, and utterly defeated. He had survived the loss of his wife and son, but the thought of losing his home, the last tangible piece of his past, was a blow from which he didn't think he could recover. Leo watched Arthur's decline with a growing sense of frustration and a quiet, simmering anger. He tried to keep their routine going, but the work felt hollow. The restored tractor sat silent. The tilled field remained unplanted. The future had been cancelled. "There has to be something we can do, Artie," Leo said one evening, his voice tight with an unfamiliar urgency. "There's no one to call," Arthur said, his voice flat. "No family left. The bank owns me, lock, stock and barrel. It's over." "It's not over," Leo insisted. "Men like that, like Henderson, they have weaknesses. They have pressure points." Arthur looked at him, a flicker of fear in his eyes. He was hearing the stranger from that first night again, not the quiet handyman he had come to know. "This isn't your fight, Leo. You should go before you get tangled up in this mess." "I am tangled up in it," Leo shot back, his voice low and intense. "You took me in when you had every reason to turn me away. You saved my life, You think I'm just going to watch some vulture in a cheap suit pick your bones clean? In that moment, Arthur saw the depth of Leo's loyalty, and it scared him more than the foreclosure. This was a man who understood debts, and he clearly felt he owed Arthur one that couldn't be repaid with a fixed engine. The next few days were tense. Arthur retreated further into his despair, while Leo became a coiled spring of restless energy. He was constantly watchful, his eyes scanning the road at the end of the driveway. He was waiting for something, or someone. Then, one afternoon, another car appeared. This one was different. It was an old, beaten-up sedan, not a banker's luxury vehicle. It drove slowly up the lane and parked near the barn. Two men got out. They weren't wearing suits. They were large, dressed in worn jeans and jackets, and they moved with a kind of predatory confidence that made the hair on Arthur's arms stand on end. They weren't looking at the house, they were looking for something, or someone. And Arthur knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they were looking for Leo. The shadows from Leo's past had finally found them. The moment the car appeared, Leo's entire demeanor shifted. The quiet farmhand vanished, replaced by a man of chilling focus and instinct. "Artie," he said, his voice a low command. "Go inside, lock the door, do not come out, no matter what you hear." Arthur was frozen, his feet rooted to the spot. "Who are they, Leo?" "They're not friends," Leo said grimly, already moving toward the side of the barn, keeping to the shadows. "Go now." The urgency in his voice finally broke Arthur's paralysis. He stumbled back to the house, his heart hammering against his ribs, and fumbled with the lock on the door. He peered through the kitchen window, his body trembling. The two men were walking toward the barn, their movements slow and deliberate. They were hunters. They split up, one circling to the back, while the other approached the large front door. Arthur watched as the first man slid the heavy barn door open and disappeared inside. A minute passed, then another. The silence was agonizing. What was happening in there? Where was Leo? Suddenly, a muffled shout erupted from the barn, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting something hard. Then, silence again. The second man, who had been circling around, now pulled out a gun and moved cautiously toward the front entrance, calling out a name. Arthur couldn't make out the word, but the tone was laced with alarm. He pressed his hand over his mouth to stifle a cry. This was real. This was the violence he had subconsciously feared from the moment he'd opened his door to a bleeding stranger. The second man entered the barn. More sounds followed, a crash of metal, a grunt of pain, a brief, desperate struggle. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch. He heard one final, definitive crack, like a heavy branch snapping, and then an unnerving quiet settled once more. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. He was alone in his house, with two potentially dead or dying men in his barn, and a man he barely knew who was clearly capable of extreme violence. Was Leo hurt? Was he waiting for Arthur? Every instinct told him to stay hidden, to call the police. But the thought of Leo, injured and alone after protecting him, was unbearable. Cautiously, he unlocked the door and stepped outside. The world seemed unnaturally still. He walked toward the barn, his legs feeling like lead. He peered into the shadowy interior and saw two figures lying motionless on the floor. Leo was standing over them, breathing heavily. He wasn't seriously hurt, just a cut on his cheek. He looked up at Arthur, and in his eyes Arthur saw not the face of a cold-blooded killer, but one of deep, profound regret. "I'm sorry, Artie," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry you had to see this. I have to go. It's not safe for you here anymore." But before he could take a step, the sound of another engine, much closer this time, filled the air. A third man, the driver of the car, was walking toward them from the driveway, a phone to his ear and a gun in his hand. They were trapped. The third man stopped about 30 yards away, his gun held steady. He hadn't seen Arthur yet, his focus entirely on Leo, who stood silhouetted in the barn's entrance. "Marco!" the man called out, his voice sharp and carrying in the still air. "Falcone sends his regards. He's not happy you ran, and he's even less happy about what you took with you." Leo, or Marco as he was apparently called, didn't flinch. He slowly raised his hands, a gesture of surrender that seemed completely at odds with the violence that had just occurred. "This has nothing to do with the old man, Gianni," he said, his voice calm and level. "Let him walk away." Gianni laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "No one walks away. Falcone wants a clean slate. The ledger, Marco. And you, the old man is just a loose end." He took a step forward, his gun aimed squarely at Leo's chest. Arthur felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Protective rage. This boy, and in that moment, he seemed no older than Michael, had protected him. He had brought his home back to life. He was not just a loose end. Before he could think, Arthur stepped out from behind the barn door, positioning himself slightly in front of Leo. "Get off my property," he said, his voice shaking but clear. Gianni's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into a cruel smirk. "Well, look at this. A regular farmer hero. Step aside, old man, this isn't your business." "You're on my land, threatening a guest in my home," Arthur stated, standing his ground. "That makes it my business." He knew it was a foolish, suicidal gesture. He was an old man with nothing but his conviction against a man with a gun, but he would not cower. Not anymore. He had spent 5 years hiding from the world, and he would not hide now. Leo moved with lightning speed. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Arthur's shoulder, spun him back into the cover of the barn, and kicked a heavy wooden crate forward. The crate slid across the dirt floor, slamming into a stack of old metal barrels. The resulting crash was deafening. It was a distraction, and it worked. Gianni flinched, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Leo needed. He wasn't armed, but he didn't need to be. He launched himself forward, not at Gianni, but toward the side, grabbing a long, rusty pitchfork that was leaning against the wall. Gianni fired, but his shot went wild, splintering the wooden doorframe where Leo had been standing a moment before. Now it was a standoff. A man with a gun against a man with a pitchfork, with an old farmer caught in the middle. "It's over, Marco!" Gianni yelled, his voice strained. "There's nowhere left to run." "I'm not running anymore," Leo said, his knuckles white around the handle of the pitchfork. His eyes were fixed on Gianni, filled with a lethal intensity. Arthur realized he was witnessing the culmination of a story that had started long before that rainy night. He wasn't just harboring a fugitive. He had given shelter to a soldier in a war he didn't understand, and the final battle was about to happen on his land. The standoff in the barn doorway was a portrait of impossible tension. Gianni, with the superior weapon, was sweating, his eyes darting between Leo and the shadowy interior of the barn, where his 2 companions lay silent. Leo, armed with a primitive farm tool, was the picture of deadly calm. He held the pitchfork not like a farmer, but like a gladiator, its tines pointed directly at Gianni's throat. "Think about this, Gianni," Leo said, his voice dangerously low. "You can walk away, tell Falcone you never found me." "He'd kill me," Gianni scoffed, but there was a tremor of fear in his voice. "He'll kill you anyway eventually," Leo countered. "You know how he is. He cleans house. You're just a broom he'll throw away when the floor is clean." The words hit their mark. A flicker of doubt crossed Gianni's face. He knew Leo was right. Their boss, Falcone, was known for his paranoia and his brutality. Loyalty to him was a short-term contract with a fatal expiration date. Arthur, still pressed against the inside wall of the barn, saw his chance. His mind, sharpened by adrenaline, was racing. He wasn't a fighter, but he knew his land. He knew its secrets. While Gianni was distracted, Arthur began to slowly, quietly, inch his way toward the back of the barn. He moved behind the old, silent tractor, its bulk hiding him from view. His target was the main water valve for the cattle trough, connected to the high-pressure pump Leo had fixed. It was old and rusted, but powerful. He reached the valve, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wrapped his trembling hands around the iron wheel. It was stiff from years of disuse. He put all his weight into it, gritting his teeth, feeling the muscles in his back and shoulders strain. Outside, the psychological battle continued. "Last chance, Marco," Gianni said, trying to regain his confidence. "Drop it." "No," Leo replied simply. At that moment, Arthur gave the wheel one last, desperate heave. It groaned in protest and then spun loose. A powerful jet of ice-cold water erupted from the spigot and the attached heavy-duty hose just outside the barn. Arthur had left the hose there after washing the tractor. With a roar, the water blasted across the yard, hitting Gianni squarely in the chest. The force was stunning, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward. His gun flew from his grasp, landing in the mud. Leo didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, not with the pitchfork, but with his body, tackling Gianni and driving him hard to the ground. The fight was over in seconds. Leo subdued the sputtering, soaked man with practiced efficiency, using Gianni's own belt to tie his hands behind his back. He stood up, breathing heavily, and looked at Arthur, who was now emerging from the barn, drenched in sweat. An expression of stunned admiration was on Leo's face. "Not bad, Artie," he said, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "Not bad at all." The immediate danger was over, but the larger problem remained. 3 unconscious or subdued mobsters were now on his property. Leo Marco was exposed, and Arthur Rossi, a simple farmer, was now an accomplice. The aftermath of the fight left a surreal quiet hanging over the farm. The 3 intruders were secured in the cellar, a damp, stone-lined room with a heavy, boltable door. As Leo, or Marco, as Arthur was now trying to think of him, finished securing the last man, he finally turned to Arthur, his face etched with exhaustion and apology. "Artie, I have to make a call," he said. "It's the only way to end this, but you need to know the truth first." They sat at Arthur's small kitchen table, the same table where he had eaten 1,000 lonely meals. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the dark story that unfolded. Marco's real name was Marco Moretti. His father wasn't just a mechanic. He was the trusted brother of Donatello Moretti, the head of one of Chicago's oldest and most respected families. It wasn't a family of street thugs, Marco explained, but a network built on old-world principles of honor, loyalty, and business. They operated restaurants, construction companies, and import businesses. But a rival, Rico Falcone, a man who dealt in drugs and brutality, had been trying to muscle into their territory. "Falcone's a snake," Marco said, his voice laced with contempt. "No honor, he preys on the weak." The conflict had escalated and Falcone had arranged a truce meeting. It was an ambush. Marco's uncle, the Don, was wounded, and Marco's father was killed. Marco had escaped, but not before grabbing a ledger book, Falcone's detailed record of his dirtiest dealings, including payoffs to cops and judges. That ledger was his death warrant and his only bargaining chip. He had been running ever since, trying to find a way to get the ledger to the right people without getting killed, when he'd been clipped by one of Falcone's men and had collapsed, bleeding, at Arthur's door. Arthur listened in stunned silence. The quiet man who had fixed his tractor and shared his meals was embroiled in a Mafia war. He wasn't a criminal in the way he'd imagined, but a man fighting for his family's survival, a soldier on the run. "So what happens now?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now I call my uncle," Marco said. "He's recovering. He's been looking for me. We end this. But Artie, when they come, they'll see all of this." He gestured around the modest farmhouse, at the worn furniture and the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. "They will know what you did for me, my family, We don't forget things like this. We don't leave debts unpaid." A shiver went down Arthur's spine. What did that mean? He had stepped into a world with its own rules, its own language of debt and repayment. He had offered a stranger a place to sleep, and in doing so had entangled his simple, broken life with the destiny of the Moretti family. He had no idea what that would mean for his future, for his farm. But as Marco made the call, speaking in rapid, low Italian, Arthur knew one thing for certain. His life of quiet solitude was over, for better or for worse. Less than 3 hours later, 2 black sedans, much finer than the banker's, rolled silently up the gravel driveway. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was far more intimidating than Gianni's loud aggression. 3 men in impeccably tailored dark suits stepped out. They were not young thugs, they were older, their faces serious and composed, their eyes missing nothing. One of them, a man with silver hair and a weary but authoritative air, walked directly to Marco, who was waiting on the porch. They embraced, a brief, powerful hug that spoke of immense relief and shared grief. "Marco, my boy," the man said in a voice that was both gravelly and warm, "you gave us a scare." "I'm sorry, Uncle Donatello," Marco replied. "I had to protect the ledger." Don Moretti then turned his attention to Arthur, who stood nervously by the door. The Don's eyes, sharp and intelligent, assessed him in an instant. He saw the worn clothes, the farmer's hands, the lines of worry and sorrow on his face. He saw the quiet dignity and the flicker of fear. He extended a hand. "You must be Mr. Arthur Rossi," he said, his English perfect, with only a trace of an accent. "My nephew has told me what you did. You showed him kindness when others would have shown him the door. You gave him sanctuary. My family is in your debt." Arthur shook the man's hand. It was firm and dry. I did what I thought was right," he stammered. The Don smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Doing what is right is not always easy. For that, you have our deepest respect." The next hour was a whirlwind of quiet, decisive action. The Don's men retrieved Falcone's men from the cellar. There were no threats, no overt violence, just a low conversation in Italian, and the 3 men were escorted into one of the cars, their faces pale with terror. They understood, better than Arthur ever could, what awaited them. Don Moretti's men were professionals. They cleaned the barn, removing any trace of the struggle. It was as if it had never happened. As they worked, the Don walked with Arthur around the property. He didn't ask questions, he observed. He saw the newly tilled field, the repaired tractor, the patched roof. He saw the foreclosure notice from the bank, which Arthur had left on the kitchen counter. He picked it up and read it, his expression unreadable. He placed it back down gently. "This, Mr. Henderson," he said calmly. "He is causing you trouble?" Arthur could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. "I see," the Don said, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at a chessboard and planning his next 10 moves. Before they left, the Don placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You are a good man, Arthur Rossi. You have a farmer's heart. You tend to what is yours, and you protect what is vulnerable. Rest now. My family will handle the rest." The sedans drove away as silently as they had arrived, taking Marco with them. The farm was quiet again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the echo of a promise, and Arthur was terrified and yet strangely hopeful of what that promise might mean. The week that followed was the strangest of Arthur's life. He was alone again, but the loneliness felt different. Marco's presence lingered in the fixed engine, the organized workshop, the seeds of hope he had planted. Arthur went about his chores, his mind replaying the incredible events. He half expected police cars to swarm his property at any moment, or for Mr. Henderson to show up with a sheriff for an eviction. But nothing happened. The phone didn't ring. No one came up the driveway. The world outside his farm seemed to have forgotten he existed. It was an unsettling peace, the calm in the eye of a hurricane. He didn't know if the Moretti family's intervention was a blessing or a curse. He had been drawn into their world, and now he was left to wonder about the consequences. Then on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the black sedans had departed, a different kind of car pulled into his driveway. It was a modest, late-model sedan driven by a young woman in a simple business suit. She looked more like a social worker than a mob associate. She knocked on his door, a warm, professional smile on her face. "Mr. Rossi?" she asked. "My name is Sophia. I'm an attorney. May I have a moment of your time?" Arthur cautiously invited her in. She sat at his kitchen table and opened a briefcase. "Mr. Rossi," she began, "I represent a private agricultural investment group. They've recently taken an interest in preserving historic family farms in this region. My clients have been made aware of your current financial difficulties with the county bank." She slid a folder across the table. "They have bought your mortgage from the bank. The entire debt is now owned by them." Arthur's heart sank. He'd just traded one predator for another. "So, who are you people?" he asked, his voice wary. "And what do you want?" "What we want, Mr. Rossi," Sophia said, her smile never wavering, "is to see this farm succeed." She explained the terms. His debt was being restructured. The interest rate was being lowered to a fraction of a percent. The payment schedule was being extended over 40 years, making the monthly amount almost negligible. Furthermore, the investment group was providing him with a grant for seed, equipment upgrades, and the hiring of one full-time farmhand, should he need one. The documents were all there, legally airtight and signed by a holding company with an anonymous name. There was no mention of Moretti. There was no trace of anything illicit. It was a miracle, delivered by a lawyer in a sensible sedan. Arthur stared at the papers, his eyes blurring with tears. This wasn't just a solution. It was a gift of a future he thought he had lost forever. "Why?" he whispered, looking at the young woman. "Why would anyone do this?" Sophia's professional smile softened into something genuinely kind. "My clients believe in certain values, Mr. Rossi: loyalty, respect, and paying their debts. They were told a story about a good man who gave a stranger shelter in a storm. They believe that an act of kindness like that, it should be rewarded." Arthur signed the papers in a daze. After Sophia left, he sat at his kitchen table for over an hour, staring at his copy of the agreement. It was real. The farm was safe. Not just safe, but secure in a way it hadn't been since his father was alive. The crushing weight of debt and failure that had been his constant companion for years had vanished, lifted by a force he still couldn't fully comprehend. It was like a fairy tale, a story you hear about but never believe could happen to you. A single act of compassion born from his own grief and a flicker of human decency had returned to him 100-fold. He walked out onto his land, the deed now feeling truly his own. He ran his hand over the rough bark of the old oak tree, looked at the sturdy beams of the barn, and felt the rich soil under his boots. This was his. It was all his. The legacy of his family was secure. A few days later, a check arrived in the mail, the grant money from the anonymous investment group. It was more money than Arthur had seen in his entire life. He went to the feed store, to the equipment dealer. He bought the best seed, new tires for the tractor, and supplies he'd only dreamed of. People in town noticed the change in him. The perpetually worried, stooped old man was gone. In his place was Arthur Rossi, a farmer with a purpose. He walked with his back a little straighter, a quiet confidence in his eyes. He hired a local young man named David, a good kid whose family had fallen on hard times, to help him with the heavy work. The farm buzzed with activity. The sound of machinery and the sight of new growth filled the days. Arthur was no longer just tending a grave, he was cultivating a future. He never heard from the Moretti family directly again. There were no more visits, no phone calls. They were ghosts, a hidden foundation upon which his new life was built. But sometimes he would find things. A crate of the finest wine from Italy left on his porch. A brand new water pump delivered with an invoice marked "Paid in Full." small, anonymous gestures of a promise kept. He also heard whispers from town. Mr. Henderson, the banker, had abruptly resigned and moved away, and news reports mentioned that the Falcone crime family had been dismantled from the inside out thanks to an anonymous tip and a ledger of evidence that had mysteriously appeared on the district attorney's desk. Justice, it seemed, had been served in more ways than one. Arthur never spoke of what had happened. It was a secret he would carry with him, a testament to the strange and hidden codes of honor that operated in the shadows of the world. He had learned that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about a shared moment of vulnerability in a storm, a debt of kindness that could change a life forever. Months turned into a year. The farm flourished. The fields that had been barren were now lush with corn and soy, their green stalks reaching for the sun. The garden overflowed with vegetables. Arthur and David worked from dawn till dusk, their shared labor forging a bond of mutual respect. The farm was alive, not just with crops, but with purpose and laughter. Arthur's life was full again. He was part of his community, selling his produce at the local market, his stall known for its quality and fairness. He was no longer the town recluse. He was Mr. Rossi, the man who had somehow turned it all around. No one knew his secret, the silent partners who had made it all possible. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, a familiar car drove up the lane. It wasn't one of the black sedans, but a simple family car. Marco got out. He looked different. The hunted, haunted look was gone from his eyes. He was wearing a simple jacket and jeans, and he looked relaxed, healthy. He looked like the man he was pretending to be all those months ago, a simple man at peace. He was carrying a small, wrapped box. "Artie," he said, a warm smile on his face. Arthur's heart swelled. He walked over and embraced him, a strong, heartfelt hug between two men who had saved each other in different ways. "Marco," he said, "it's good to see you." They sat on the porch, just as they had done before, watching the sun begin to set over the thriving fields. "My uncle sends his deepest regards," Marco said. "He's well. Our family is secure now, thanks to you." "I didn't do much," Arthur said, shaking his head. "You did everything, Artie," Marco insisted. "You reminded us what our values are really about. It's not about business or power. It's about protecting family. And you became our family that night." He handed Arthur the box. Inside was a beautifully crafted silver-framed photograph. It was of Marco, an older, distinguished man who must have been Don Moretti, and another man who looked just like Marco with kind, smiling eyes. "My father," Marco said softly, pointing to the smiling man, "and my uncle. I wanted you to have it. So you know the faces of the men who will be grateful to you for the rest of their lives." Arthur took the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. He had lost his son, his only family. And now, in the most unlikely way imaginable, he had found a new one. A quiet farmer and a Mafia prince, bound by a code of honor that transcended their different worlds. They sat in comfortable silence, two men from different worlds, forever linked by an act of kindness in a barn on a stormy night. Arthur Rossi was no longer alone. He had a family that watched over him from the shadows, ensuring that his quiet life of dignity and hard work would never be threatened again. That one small act of kindness, opening a barn door to a stranger, unraveled a lifetime of loneliness and fear for Arthur. It reminds us that we never truly know the impact our choices will have on others, or how they might echo back to us in the most unexpected ways. What did you think of Arthur's decision? Would you have done the same? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have a story about an unexpected act of kindness, we'd love to read it. And for more stories that explore the hidden connections that bind us all, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.